Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast, presented to you from Cape Town here in the Western Cape, South Africa. The podcast is presented with a view to providing a platform and voice for built environment professionals and interest groups who are working towards transforming the places and spaces here in South Africa. It's dedicated to the individuals and community groups who are supporting both the formal and informal processes that are shaping our cities and our spaces. It's 10 years ago since the final whistle blew on the highly anticipated FIFA 2010 World Cup held here in South Africa. Prior to the event, expectations had been high on how and if South Africa could deliver on the event, and certainly in terms of executing the event itself and managing it, South Africa got 10 marks out of 10 in terms of the delivery. It certainly got a lot of goodwill around the globe and recognition that South Africa was able to host an event, a global event of such a scale as the FIFA World Cup. Crime fell during that period. Footballing tourists, both within the country and from beyond our shores, flocked to the stadiums and the fan zones around the country. And basically, the idea of using sporting ventures and infrastructure to start kickstarting a new catalyst for transformation and economic growth was a lot of the thinking behind that investment and the desire to bring the World Cup not only to South Africa but to the African continent for the first and to date only time in FIFA's history. Beyond playing on the Madiba Magic, which was such a central part of the bid, South Africa also broke the bank financially in securing the event here. Billions of rands of investment for new or upgrades to airports and stadia, to public spaces and public transportation systems preceded the event, and some of those aspects have operated successfully and others have yet to really justify the investment after the event closed. It was certainly a massive gamble in diverting public funds that critics would argue would have been better spent on housing, on infrastructure and public services. And certainly the debate had raged before, during and continues long after the event has finished. In today's Talking Transformation episode, we're going to look at the legacy of the 2010 World Cup. We're going to ask questions around how do you objectively measure the success and that legacy. And in so doing, we're joined by historian Dr. Dean Allen. Dean was part of the assessment team employed to look at different perspectives and has taken an ongoing interest in the assessment of FIFA 2010 history as both a historian, an author, and as a public speaker. I was very much intrigued by his online lecture on this topic and was delighted when he was kind enough to accept the invitation to join us on the Talking Transformation podcast and discuss his perspectives and his findings. Just how transformative was the event and what can we learn from such massive investment initiatives in the future? Like myself, Dean is originally from the UK and you'll pick up on that immediately from his accent. What we also share is the deep love and passion for South Africa, the people, the places, its history and the future of the country. The only thing I can hold against him is his love of Bristol City Football Club. Clearly he has a lot to learn about football, but then again, don't we all? And on a serious note, I am deeply indebted to him for sharing his thoughts and his research with the Talking Transformation podcast. Please do engage with us. Find us on the social media platforms such as Twitter via Talking Transfo and the number 1, or leave us a voice message on our voice message service on the Anchor podcast platform. In the meantime, enjoy the episode and hear from Dr. Dean Allen. So it's just gone 6 o'clock here in Cape Town, and a few hundred kilometres away in the Eastern Cape, I'm joined by Dr. Dean Allen. Dean, how are you keeping and where do we find you this evening?
Good evening, Pete. Yeah, nice to join you. I'm actually in a place called Cradock in the Eastern Cape, beautiful part of the world. Really hot evening here. I'm here exploring the history of the region, which I'm really excited to do.
That's fantastic. You've certainly been getting around South Africa in the last few months. Certainly after lockdown. I think you were up in KZN a couple of weeks ago. You've been doing a bit of a tour.
Yeah, been fortunate. Just before lockdown, we managed to get out of Cape Town and head for the country. I'm a country boy by heart, so we ended up, would you believe, spending 6 months in wilderness, which is a lovely beautiful part of South Africa to see out the lockdown. So we had incredible views of the ocean and the mountains. And then a few weeks ago, I was contacted by a friend of mine here who runs the hotel in Cradock, and she said, "Well, would you like to get back on the road and come out and write some of your historical stories, your interesting stories that you do for other places?" And I was delighted to accept the offer. So we got in our car and we drove over to Cradock, Eastern Cape, and then the past week we've been across to KZN to see friends, and as you know, Pete, picking up all these wonderful stories on my travels as we go. So it's a wonderful way of sort of breaking lockdown. and being on the road again. And you really do appreciate this wonderful country that we live in.
Well, again, looking forward to hearing a bit more about that in due course. Before we get to 2010 itself, let's start with your story. How did you end up getting here in South Africa, and obviously your passion and your uncovering of particularly some of these smaller towns and places around the country, and obviously ending up working on this massive global project and trying to understand its impact. How did you end up in that space, Dean?
Well, my love affair with South Africa goes right back to the mid-90s. As you can hear, Pete, I'm a Englishman like yourself, born and bred. But in the mid-90s, I arrived in South Africa. It was actually through a woman, would you believe? Van der Merwe was her name. I'm from the West Country back there in England, and I met her in my local town of Taunton. And I was going nowhere in an office job in my mid-20s, and I think she saw something in me. She was a dentist, and she said, "Why don't you go back to university?" So that's what I did. It changed my life. I'm the first person in my whole family to go to university. I signed
Absolutely
up to do a PE degree, or to be a physical education teacher at Cardiff University there. But as soon as I arrived in Cape Town, I knew this was where I wanted to be. And then the relationship, unfortunately, didn't last, but my love affair with South Africa did. I knew that there was something about this country. I found myself at Stellenbosch University, and it was quite a privilege to be there, because I soon learned about the passion for South African sport.
Sure.
So one thing we've got in common in this wonderful nation of ours, we've all got our cultural differences, 11 official languages, but we get behind sport. So it was going to be my journey to write the history of a sport in this country. Yeah, of course, it had been done before, but I don't think from the perspective I came from. I was more looking about what went beyond the try line, as it were, in terms of rugby. I mean, how sports had developed in this country, how the British had brought sport originally, but how it had become this South African passion. And that's what led me to this funny little place out in the Karoo called Matjiesfontein. And that's what I'm kind of famous for, I think, more than anything here in South Africa. I wrote a book called Empire, War and Cricket, which is from my PhD. And it's turned into a bestseller, I'm proud to say. Sold over 10,000 copies here in South Africa, which is
congratulations,
quite a thing.
Dean. That's huge.
Thank you. Which is quite a thing for a book with the title Cricket in it. But of course, it's not just about cricket. It's about life. It's about the characters that shape this country. And Matjiesfontein is an interesting one, because a lot of the listeners would have heard of this quirky little place, but nobody had ever written its official history. So one day I found myself as a tourist walking down that main street, and as you know, there's not much there, but there's quite a story behind it. So I started to piece this thing together, and it was going to be my journey. So with the support of a man called David Rawdon, who bought Matjiesfontein in the late 60s and transformed it back to this place that we know today, this kind of Victorian folly in the middle of nowhere, he said to me, "Well, you write a book about Matjiesfontein, Dean, and the breakfasts are on me." And that's why I often say it took me 10 years to write the book, because the breakfasts are very good there. But joking aside, I realized this was going to be quite a responsibility, because I managed to get hold of the family archives that from the original creator of Matjiesfontein. But it was a bigger picture. It was about, obviously, the colonial era. It was about the kind of stuff that was going on, the dirty politics of the time, and bring in this idea of sport as well, the fact that sport was used as part of this political game, part of the British Empire. And it's widely known that some of the earliest cricket games were played there, but as I said, it's not about sport per se. But I got involved with the people of Matjiesfontein, and the relationship with that wonderful place has certainly grown over the years. I was involved in the local school. We were doing sports classes. I managed to get some soccer jerseys from Bristol City, my team back in England a few years ago, and they never lost for 3 years playing in those shirts, which shows you the pride that
fantastic.
Which is amazing story, and it brought me closer to the community, and I realized what a responsibility and what a privileged position I was in. And as I said, I've spent probably the last 5 or 6 years touring the country, telling this incredible story. I mean, people never get tired of it, and I don't get tired of telling it, because it is I often say it's a Downton Abbey of South Africa. It's got a bit of everything in, but I think if we would all remember our history if it's told in the form of stories. And that's exactly what I do. I try to tell entertaining stories, but bring a message through. And I think Matjiesfontein is one of those little places here in South Africa that can teach us so much about the past, but also what's happening today and the future as well.
So from the small hamlet village of Mikey's Fontaine to the biggest show on earth, the FIFA 2010 World Cup. Let's talk about that, Dean.
Yeah, I mean, what a opportunity to be here and move back to South Africa in 2010 and be part of the research and to be able to talk 10 years on about something that perhaps transformed this country alongside other great events in the history. I think the 2010 FIFA World Cup goes down as one of those markers in South African history that we'll be reflecting on for years to come.
I get a sense that there was almost inevitability about South Africa getting the 2010 World Cup. We know we'd had the disappointment of 2006 when we lost out to Germany, but we'd had successful events in 1995 with the Rugby World Cup, 2003 the Cricket World Cup, and then, as you say, we'd had the lead up and the thinking around Cape Town's what would turn out to be a failed bid for the Olympics. So, but the idea that FIFA could deny Nelson Mandela almost a second time around, can't help but feel that there was a degree of inevitability about the second bid and ultimately the success of 2010 and that coming to South Africa. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this was Africa's time. I think FIFA realised that, in terms of sharing out this tournament around the world, that Africa, it was time for this event to reach the continent. Despite all the carnival that goes behind the bidding process, and of course there's a lot of politics as well. If we look at how the mega events such as the Olympics and the Football World Cup, the Commonwealth Games, for example, how they're actually spread around, they're almost shared out continent by continent. And there was a glaring gap, of course, with Africa not receiving one of these mega events. So with Nelson Mandela at the helm, I think, and the fact that this was going to be an absolute PR, wonderstroke from FIFA, it was a case of finding the right country in Africa. So as I said, the interesting thing for me, despite this being South Africa's tournament, it was being billed as an African tournament, this kind of African renaissance. And if you compare that with what happened only 4 years ago when Germany had the World Cup, this was not billed as a European World Cup. It was billed as the German World Cup. So there was something different here. But I think in terms of preparation, you look at the sort of the flirtation between Thabo Mbeki and Sepp Blatter in those years leading up to it. As I've mentioned in a lot of my research, they were talking about this African renaissance and building up this sort of development as a continent-wide plan as opposed to South African plan. And often in their conversations, they didn't even mention South Africa or even the word football or soccer. It was all about developing Africa as a continent. Now, if we look at the key pillars of the 2010 business plan, there were certain requirements that FIFA had. And these actually remain the same, if not higher than 2006. So I think South Africa was being prepared as a country that could deliver these requirements, such as, for example, infrastructure provisions. As we know, a lot of money went into infrastructure. The World Cup stadia, these world-class stadiums that were built around the country, of course, had to be of a certain standard. Transportation, safety and security. Now, other requirements such as ticket sales, broadcasting rights, sponsorship, that was handled by FIFA. But they were requirements that remained the same, if not higher than 2006. Now, in terms of legacy, here in South Africa, we were promised that the South Africa or African image was going to be enhanced through holding this tournament. Economic benefits, debatable perhaps, but things such as football development, skills development, but nation building and transformation, which is something obviously we're interested in this podcast, was something that was always high on the agenda. The fact that this world tournament was going to reach South Africa, it was going to put South Africa on the map, it was going to give South Africa a purpose to be able to prove itself as a nation to the rest of the world, was going to have this transformation effect in terms of economics, in terms of deliverables, in terms of infrastructure, for example. So I think that there was an element of inevitability. Perhaps you could even say, in more recent years, the fact that Russia got it in 2018 and we're seeing around the corner that Qatar, a part of the world that's not known as a football hotbed, is now the next in line because the Middle East hasn't hosted a tournament of this size. So as we can see, the pattern kind of goes on and on. But back in 2010, South Africa was certainly the chosen one to represent the continent of Africa.
With that, Dean, you get involved with the research and to already at that very early stage try to understand what the impact of this is going to be in a very sort of scientific way in terms of a research methodology. You're working there with the CPUT, you're lecturing there, but you've been pulled into that research space. Tell us a bit about the remit. What was it you were being asked to look at? Who was basically employing you? Whose doors did you have to go knocking on? And what were some of those prelim findings? That would be a sort of starting point for your investigation back in the day.
Well, it was quite a privilege to be part of this research, Pete. For me, it was the advantages that we had a remit from the city of Cape Town. But we were working in isolation. You see, FIFA didn't encourage this kind of research because the city of Cape Town wanted to find out whether all this money that they were spending, whether it was actually doing what the government was suggesting, and whether it was going to reach the people that that it had been promoted for. Now, we were part of a group from the academic institutions in the Western Cape. So I was at Cape Peninsula University of Technology, as you mentioned. We worked alongside people from the University of Western Cape, University of Cape Town, and Stellenbosch University. And we came together, various academics and researchers, to look at the social economic impact of this tournament. Yes, for Cape Town, but obviously our findings were going to have a wider remit around the country. There were other research groups doing studies, but in isolation, as I said. One of the perhaps failings of the research is we didn't have a coordinated approach. But I don't think that undermined our findings. What we found, we were looking at not only the impact on visitors to the Cape and to South Africa, so tourism, but we were also looking at local residents and local businesses, certainly in the Cape Town wider area. So we conducted surveys and interviews both during but after the tournament as well. And obviously we were out on the ground, with our clipboards, and we were those people in sort of fluorescent jackets. You could see at a lot of events asking these kind of questions.
Could see you coming, Dean.
Exactly, but it was a fantastic thing to be involved in. But I think the impact or the effect of this research only came later, because I think they saw my ability to be able to interview perhaps the key stakeholders. So I was tasked to interview people like Danny Jourdain, the operations managers of a stadium in Cape Town, for example, and a lot of the key stakeholders, not only in the Cape, but also around the country. And I would ask a similar set of questions, and the findings were often the same. And we were talking now after the event. So I was conducting these interviews almost a year afterwards, when people have had a time to reflect on the impact of the tournament. So bringing all this research together, as well as the quantitative and the qualitative data, of course, gave this research its effectiveness, as it were. And looking back now, 10 years on, can you believe? I mean, I can't believe where that time has gone. I think we can look back and using the findings and make this reflection on whether this tournament was worth it in terms of socioeconomic gains. But we can also look back and think, well, what about the things that were claimed at the time? The things such as, building this social cohesion, the nation branding, for example, skills development, and those kind of softer things that weren't tangible at the time. So, yeah, it was certainly a responsibility at the time, but we would have liked for that research perhaps to be coordinated, say, with the guys over in Brazil 4 years later. We could have made comparisons. Yeah. But the key here is FIFA did not encourage this kind of research at a national level. So the city of Cape Town, in their wisdom, employed the academic institutions to conduct this research at the time, well, before, during, and after the event. So at least we could have some data about the effectiveness of this tournament.
And Dean, I mean, you've mentioned Danny Jourdain at that stage, a very, very powerful character in South African sports administration, and certainly in terms of the governance of the event. He brought the tournament to South Africa, and when you met with him as the main man behind the bid, what was his take on the events and the immediate sort of reflection on the tournament and the benefit of it?
Well, it was quite interesting, actually. I got an invitation, or should I say a gap in his agenda, to go and meet with him up at the top of Santon Towers. It was a bit like meeting sort of Donald Trump. I remember we were going in one by one, all these people interviewing him. And I was lucky enough to get the last slot of the day. And I think he was quite enamored by the fact that I was this Englishman who was doing this research, inside South Africa. So he was quite open, actually, about the whole thing. But the one thing he did talk about more than anything was this opportunity for South Africa to have this marketing opportunity. The fact that South Africa for an entire month would have the eyes of the world upon South Africa, and through the medium of football, through the FIFA World Cup, it would enable South Africa to improve its perception, or its brand abroad, as it were. So he talked about economics, he talked about branding, he talked about marketing opportunities. It was very much from a business point of view. And he commented, how much would this cost from a marketing perspective to have one country in the world's eye for an entire month. And he focused on Cape Town. He said, what are the benefits to a city like Cape Town? So that was clear. I mean, of course, he talked about social cohesion and sports development. But for me, the main impression I got from Danny Jordan was the fact that he saw this as a business opportunity. That there was no doubt about it that South Africa would make money in terms of tourism, in terms of business relations, in terms of its own branding, in terms of place marketing, and this enhanced international perception. And I thought that was quite interesting. When I spoke to other key stakeholders, perhaps more involved in the operations, for example, I spoke to the World Cup Director of Operations in Cape Town the following year, and he was more sort of, can I say, not so enthusiastic about what had happened, the experiences. He expressed the fact that perhaps many of them were naive to what they had to do, or perhaps the control they had on this tournament. They didn't realize how powerful FIFA was, for example, and how they called the shots, from everything to merchandising, to stadium management, to the control of what was sold, in and around the city. And he said to me at the time that if they had their time again, they would certainly have more control on how this was run. They would insist on that. But he said, in terms of legalities, everything was signed off, and they had to do what FIFA asked of them. The other interesting thing that I found out was the naivety when it came to the media portrayal of the whole tournament. There was a lot of negativity. I don't know if people picked up on it here in South Africa, but I certainly did, from an international perspective. That the media in places like the United Kingdom, even United States, other parts of Europe, such as Germany, those that had teams coming to South Africa, they were saying that this was going to be an absolute disaster. Fans were going to arrive in South Africa and they were going to be in trouble in terms of safety, security. So when the media were interviewing a lot of these people, for example, the director of operations here, there was one case where a reporter from Al Jazeera, would you believe, was asking him very sort of broad questions about operations about the World Cup, and then all of a sudden said, well, what about the street children in Cape Town? We've heard there's going to be a camp, that these homeless people are going to be put into a camp. And he said, at the time I couldn't believe it, but this was a live interview. And he realized that there was an agenda with the foreign media. They were trying to paint this picture that this World Cup was going to be a disaster. So a year down the line, they could look back and think, well, again, that was perhaps naive. Now we know that it was a fantastic success. As I mentioned in my research, crime levels in this country went down by 50%. So that was never going to be imagined. I mean, and we know that people that visited these shores had an incredible experience. They experienced the South African hospitality, the fact that it was a safe experience as well. And we know tourism levels have gone up because people went home then, and next thing they bring in their families, year on year afterwards. So my role was two-pronged in the research. I was part of the field work certainly during the tournament, but in the year or so afterwards, I think by the time the dust had settled, I was used to interview the key stakeholders and ask them these difficult questions. Was it worth it? What would you do differently? When it came to interviewing Danny Jordan, the one thing that came through was he was very clear about the business benefits, the economic benefits to South Africa. So he continually talked about the enhanced international perception and how it was worth, how much it would be worth to a city like Cape Town to have this international exposure. And the fact that it was a positive experience, he said you couldn't put in money terms. So I thought that was interesting. It was very much in terms of economic benefits that he was reflecting upon.
That is the million-dollar question. Was it worth it? Was your assessment that the multi-billion rand investment from the public purse worth it in the end? And what do you think, though, beyond the operations of a bus rapid transit system in, for example, Cape Town or a Gautrain up in Johannesburg, are there other elements that are not necessarily public transport related that you think we can point to and say, job well done?
Well, I think, Pete, we should point out the statistics that we actually discovered in terms of the outcome. I mean, for example, the whole 2010 experience created, would you believe, 695,000 jobs. Now, a lot of those were temporary, albeit there was a gross impact of 94 billion to South Africa's economy. Now, I'll probably mention in a minute how much we spent, even though we don't really know how much we spent. But we do know that in terms of infrastructure, there was considerable development. There were more than 350,000 tourists. But this is the key for me in terms of nation branding. Do you know that there were 28 billion cumulative viewers over that month period? So in other words, South Africa was in the spotlight of the world for that month, and largely the message was positive. So the most important spin-off for me was the improved perceptions abroad of this country. Now, on a local scale, I mean, listeners will remember, I'm sure, the incredible atmosphere of the time. The fact that there was this idea of social cohesion. I mean, people were coming together from different parts of the city, different parts of the country, and enjoying this festival of football. As I mentioned, the improved perceptions abroad in terms of safety and security. There was a famous case of an English football fan, would you believe, arriving at Cape Town Airport with a bulletproof vest on. He was that concerned about his safety because the media, international media, prior to this tournament, it was largely negative. And that was something I found from the key stakeholders. They were also surprised that they were being built up for a fall. And that's one of these things about here in South Africa. I mean, we're both passionate supporters of the country, and we know that the perception abroad is often negative. So, I mean, this football fan from England quickly realised this was one of the most friendly and perhaps one of the safest places he's ever watched England play football. And that was an incredible result. In terms of partnerships as well, there was an integrated approach. In fact, we saw, can we say, political parties working together, perhaps for the only time in recent history, because they had to get this thing done. So different departments of governments were working together to make sure this actually worked. And that the spin-off was, of course, knowledge management. We now have this idea that we can run events of this scale, and not just in terms of what was happening on the pitch, but more importantly, transportation, the infrastructure, safety, security, as I mentioned, and things like branding and merchandising. Albeit they were controlled by FIFA, there was also knowledge, enhancement here because of that. The budget and expectations was the big controversy. Now, we were promised that this was going to cost us X amount leading up to the World Cup, and certainly that figure was well under what came in. And we were also given these expectations, I say we as South Africans, that this tournament was going to make a lot of us rich. You probably remember at the time that people were, building an extra room onto their home. They were going to welcome all these tourists spending their money. Well, in fact, the reality showed us that some hotels in Cape Town and around the country were under occupancy during that period. Because if you think about it, for every tourist that comes because of a tournament, many stay away because they don't want to come at the time of a mega tournament. So the expectations that FIFA built for us were certainly higher. And I think subsequently countries have realized that this is going to be the pot of gold that FIFA promised, certainly back in 2010. So the likes of Russia and Qatar would realize that. So their spin-offs perhaps are going to be political. The likes of Russia, we now have an enhanced perception of how that country is run, albeit through sort of rose-tinted glasses. But for me, the fact that the main legacy, the positive, was the fact that South Africa as a nation could now reinvent its brand. It could actually show a different side of itself. Now, without focusing on apartheid and the troubles that have happened in the past, and obviously the massive economic inequality that we still experience in the country today, it was an opportunity to show the rest of the world that this this was, in many respects, a developed nation. So that, for me, I know it's a long answer. It is a really complex thing to say. You have to take the positives with the negatives. Now, many people listening will say, well, what about the stadium, for example, that still lie around the country as white elephants? We've got a super stadium in Cape Town that the rugby team is going to move into next year, just around the corner. Perhaps that's the only way it's going to be sustained. But if you go to a place like Polokwane, as I did with my research, you've got this town in the middle of nowhere with this world-class sports stadium, and it's not used.
With the giraffe structures.
Well, no, that's in Nelspruit, by the way.
Sorry, Nelspruit, of course. That's
Nelspruit,
right. Yeah.
Polokwane's further north, but Nelspraight's another example. I mean, they've tried to pay some of our football teams to go and play there, but you're literally looking at a crowd of 2,000 in a 50,000 stadium. So yes, and that was something that Sepp Blatter demanded, of course, that these super, very, can we say, tourist-friendly, eye-catching stadiums were built. And as you know, I mean, we've got Newlands in Cape Town. We've perhaps got Athlone, but he demanded that a stadium be built in the eye-catching sort of Greenpoint area with the mountain in the background. And I think my favourite quote from the BBC is, "No matter the result of the match tonight, England have never played in a more beautiful setting." And that's what it's all about. You see, it's about the image and the impact of not only FIFA, but of this game we call football, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And so South Africa, was part of that party for June and July in 2010, but we're left to clear up perhaps afterwards. So it's an interesting thing to look back on the impact on a nation level. I think it was positive. On a city level to Cape Town, I think Cape Town certainly put on a good show. But did it transform societies? Did it transform communities? Even from a sporting point of view, are we a better nation in terms of football? Well, Bafana have gone down the rankings since 2010. Indeed, so it certainly didn't develop us as a football nation, did it? And as I said, in terms of inflation, we're still paying off the money that tournament cost us.
Given the country's difficult last decade, a decade which has been characterized by state capture and by an extremely sluggish economy, to put it mildly. And in fact, even before COVID, we were in this technical recession as a country. We'd seen credit rating downgrades and also. Do you think those had an impact on that legacy, or do you think that in spite of whatever we'd done, and no matter how good a show and investment and infrastructure had been put in, that those elements were always going to have a further damaging impact? Or do you think that there's some sort of correlation between these different events and where we find ourselves in 2020, whichever way you look at it from an economic point of view, is not a healthy position, and obviously worsened by COVID. And just to illustrate my point, the point you make about the beautiful backdrop where England are playing in Greenpoint Stadium with Cape Town backdrop, it's a very different proposition when it's been stood vacant for the last 6 months and probably for the forthcoming for the next year or so. There's going to be no Foo Fighters playing, no Red Hot Chili Peppers playing, who knows what the Stormers are going to be playing too when they get there. And that obviously means that there's no revenue coming in, and no revenue from bums on seats equates to massive operating costs which are not being covered. So, sorry, I'm trying to throw a whole range of things in here, Dean, and just sort of my thinking about these issues. But any thoughts on the bigger state issues in South Africa post 2010 and some of the operational legacy that we are left holding?
Well, first of all, it didn't help, did it? The fact that you're spending all this money on something that a lot of people would say is unnecessary. I mean, we're talking about hosting a football tournament at the end of the day. I just want to take us back to some of the stats I use in my talk. I mean, Grant Thornton were employed to project the impact or the economic impact and the kind of expenditure. It's interesting that as early as 2003, they were talking about a direct expenditure of something like 12 billion. But by 2008, that had gone up to nearly 15 billion. So this kind of expenditure model was actually getting away from us. The fact that like everything, the cost of this was going up. We'd already signed up for it, but the cost of this tournament was actually going up. Almost on a daily basis. Now, in terms of the cost, it was quite incredible. I mean, these are ballpark figures, but they're widely accepted. In terms of transport and supporting infrastructure, 9 billion rand was spent on this. Stadia, 8.4 billion rand. Now, non-infrastructure, sport and recreation, I mean, you're talking 400 million rand, arts and culture, safety and security, less. But in terms of supporting infrastructure, that's where the main expenditure went, because you had to get a country like South Africa, which I said is in many respects first world, but certainly third world in other areas. FIFA were calling the shots. So they wanted a world-class, safe event that didn't affect their own brand. So that's where the government had to sell this to the population. Now, to answer your question, I don't think anybody could have predicted the kind of roller coaster we've been on since 2010. Now, you could argue that the World Cup actually, in terms of long term, has given us a platform on which to project ourselves as a country in which to do business with and to a place to come on holiday. And I'm sure there's been a lot of international investment from places around the world that wouldn't normally deal with us. You've got to remember, we had teams from South America, from the Far East playing here, and that these relationships have been built. But no, I think the fact that this money is still being paid back, the fact that we've got these wide elements of stadiums, people cannot see the tangible difference to their own lifestyle. It didn't make people rich. It didn't improve perhaps our sports teams and sport development on the local level. That's where the controversy comes in. And I think 10 years on, we can reflect on that. And I think it needs to be discussed. I mean, obviously, something like COVID-19 has come in and changed our perspective on everything. But when it comes to how our money was spent over the last decade, the impact of this tournament, probably for the last 15 years, it will be something that we're still addressing in the years to come, because it, as I said, it did take a lot of money. And I think going back to my discussions with the key stakeholders, they all said one thing: we would do it differently if we had the opportunity again. And I think I asked that question, would you do it again? And not many of them said, yes, we would. But they all said they would have a higher element of control. Now, whether that was possible with FIFA and the juggernaut that came into town with Sepp Blatter, this powerful man at the top, calling the shots at the time in 2010, as I said, it's a bit different now because he's been removed and FIFA supposedly have got a lot more kind of transparency in their operations. But I also think that other countries looked at what happened here in South Africa and perhaps in Brazil. They were a similar country in terms of the way it was handled there and the money it cost. And they don't want to get their fingers burnt when it comes to this. But the other thing I should say in terms of our research, and it really does tell you a lot, Pete, FIFA did not encourage this kind of research. They did not support it. We reached out and tried to get some kind of affiliation with them. They didn't want to know. It was only really the city of Cape Town, through their own independent sort of motivation, that allowed this to happen. Because if you think about it, what FIFA don't want is this message, a lot of it negative, to be passed on to the next party holder, which in this case was Brazil. And they want to make sure that almost these messages are kept in-house. And this was just South Africa's issue, and it wouldn't be an issue with Brazil. But we know 4 years on, the likes of Rio de Janeiro, they were struggling financially to support the building of stadiums and infrastructure, which you can look at comparisons, of course.
In fact, I think one of the stark contrasts between the Brazilian and the South African World Cups was, that feel-good factor. Whichever way you looked at it, I mean, this country was rocking in the lead up to the finals themselves, and a very positive sort of general populist response to it. If I remember, there was actually protests and so forth, major protests in Brazil around the thought that in probably the most football mad nation in the world, that they were saying that this is money badly spent right up front and very, very public in their condemnation.
No, there was certainly more questions asked, I think, Pete. Again, it's a naivety in South Africa. I mean, I mentioned the stat about crime, which is a fantastic statistic. The fact that crime, almost dropped by 50% during the World Cup. It was almost like our criminals were taking the month off to also enjoy this festival of football.
And enjoying the games, yeah?
Enjoying it. And this was something, as I said, which I love about South Africa, and I'm sure you share that. The fact that people get together behind a good cause. They do come together in adversity. They put aside all the the question marks over, kind of FIFA's control and the costs. And they thought, well, it's here. So for a month, we're going to put on a show and we're going to show the rest of the world we can do that. And that was what I found in terms of the questioning afterwards. There was this idea from people on the streets, businesses and residents, that the pride came in South Africa hosting this party, hosting this tournament, and making sure that people left with a good experience. And so I do think that was tied up with this, as I said, and almost a naivety in the fact that what this tournament was going to mean to South Africa, what it was going to cost. But that's something I love about the country, because we do make a plan here, and we do, despite the difficulties, get on with things. Now, from a football point of view, and I'm sure you'll agree, it wasn't the best tournament. I mean, you can't compare it with Brazil. I mean, my claim to fame, which I'm not that proud of, I went to watch the first 3 matches and I never saw a goal. Can you believe it? 3 0-0s in a row, but it didn't matter in a way, because it wasn't about what was happening on the pitch. For me, it was about the fan parks. It was about the fact that people were now mixing. They were getting together. They were working together. And there was this incredible pride. If your team lost, you supported another team. You went on and you celebrated the fact that South Africa was now able to show the rest of the world its true colours, shall we say. The fact that we've been told we were the Rainbow Nation, or we are the Rainbow Nation, certainly post-democracy, and it was an opportunity to show the rest of the world that. And I think that's what I got out of the tournament more than anything. The fact that as a nation we were able to rebrand ourselves despite the incredible costs. And as I said, and the key stakeholders would certainly agree that if we were ever to do this again, we'd retain more control, and we'd do it perhaps differently.
I got to concur with you. I mean, I just remember even when South Africa had gone out of the tournament, the love for Ghana, if you remember, Ghana had such a great run of it, and sort of what was Bafana became Bagana, and the whole country getting behind the Ghanaian team, and that those were really truly remarkable and life affirming times and memories. And I'd like to come back to your other lighter moments of that tournament. You've shared the idea of watching 3 very flat games. Anything? What was the game that you remember most? Who was your best player? What do you remember watching from that? If you had to take 1 or 2 real best memories from it, on the field, what would it be? As a football fan, what do you remember about it, Dean?
Well, I was fortunate enough to watch the quarterfinal between Germany and Argentina. And there we had Diego Maradona and Lionel Messi in front of us. I mean, 2 of the probably the greatest footballers of all time, representing Argentina as manager and player, of course. But the Germans, as they did a job on them, and they wiped the field with them that day. And I can always remember looking at a forlorn Lionel Messi and thinking, well, is he ever going to lift that cup with Argentina? And that was a memory for me. To see these stars of world football in our stadiums was incredible. But for me, I was lucky enough. I'm involved with Durbanville Football Club, and we managed to get tickets through that local affiliation down there in Cape Town. But for me, I stood there and I watched the crowd, and just the amazement of people to see these superstars. I was also in Port Elizabeth watching Ronaldo play for Portugal against the Ivory Coast. Another 0-0, by the way, there. But it didn't matter for me. It was about what happened off of the pitch, Pete, to be quite honest. It was what was happening in the cities, and it was an incredible feel-good factor. I remember friends of mine from England arriving in Cape Town without accommodation. Within an hour or so, they chatted to locals and they were put up. I mean, this is the kind of hospitality that South Africans are famous for, and I was so proud to sort of be part of that as well. So, the actual nitty-gritty of the figures and legacy and the politics, of course, is something that can leave a sour taste long after the time. But I think we've all got to remember, whether you like football or not, that this was something important. But a funny moment it just came to me now was not everybody appreciates football in South Africa like we do back in the UK, of course. And I remember being at Newlands Cricket Ground, and there was a guy behind me in the 6 months leading up to it, and I heard the conversation. He said, "What's this football tournament coming into town?" He said they've even cancelled some of Western Province games and Stormers. And I thought, well, there you are. There's a man who doesn't appreciate the scale of the FIFA World Cup. But I'm sure during that tournament he did. I've very, very rarely met people who didn't understand the scale of it once it arrived. But remember, the biggest legacy for many international viewers was not the crime and not the corruption. It was the vuvuzela. So if I ever have a conversation with our British friends, at least they don't have to worry too much about the serious things of life. They're worrying about the noise from a plastic trumpet that, of course, made the South African World Cup very distinct.
Certainly a unique soundtrack. That's a fact.
Indeed. But that was all part of it, wasn't it? It was all part of the carnival and part of picking up the culture from the people. And I mean, looking back now, Pete, the colours, the what it did, it really did represent what was great. What is great about this country, and we saw it last year, of course, albeit the Springboks winning a Rugby World Cup. What a victory can do, and how important sport is in this country. So, as a sports historian and someone who's written about it and been here since the 90s and seen this country develop, often through sport, we're on a roller coaster. 2010, of course, was a significant time in this country's history.
It's interesting that you raise some of that, Dean. If I look at your journey, and it's been a journey that's taken you north and south frequently. It's taken you to Lord's Cricket Ground in London. It's taken you to those penthouse suites that you talked about in Sandton Towers. And you've been, and you spend quite a lot of your time in these very sort of obscure, smaller towns or hamlets throughout the country. What is the experience? What is the overarching experience? Whether it was from Australia, your longer term that you spent here in South Africa, your foundation in the UK. What has it taught you as a historian, as an anthropologist? Around transformation. What does the word sort of mean to you? You've talked about this event, but it sort of not living up to its transformative ambition. But in terms of some of the other things that you've looked at, I mean, you've looked at small places like Matjiesfontein and transformation of a place in the middle of nowhere to what would become quite an important small town in the formative years of the Western Cape in terms of, the colonial era. You're looking now at Cradock through a lens of what that can do. Each of these things began to leave roots and legacy, which is either for better or worse, had profound impact and transformative abilities. And so I'd really be interested, typically the podcast deals in the built environment and sort of very academic and practical discussions on it. I'd really like to hear your alternative take on it, Dean. Any thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, I'm in a position of great privilege. I first arrived in 96, 97, and I can remember the discussions I would have when I first arrived. There was, despite what happened in 95 with Mandela winning the Rugby World Cup, I mean, there was a lot of people who were despondent about this country. So I've been part of this journey post-democracy. So as a historian, as I often say to my students, you don't have to look back 100 years. I mean, history is what happened an hour ago. So you need to look at the past to understand where we are now. So I've always used that kind of lens of where South Africa was in the past. Now, my specialist era, perhaps, is the late Victorian, the idea of British Empire, of the British bringing their culture here, their sport and whatever. And that's what brought me to a place like Matjiesfontein. And a lot of the buildings we see in our towns and cities in South Africa from that period, you can see the structures. Now, transformation is the key word here. And I think in terms of physicality, we can see our environment changing around us. I travel a lot here in the Eastern Cape, and you can see some of the towns which probably 100 years ago were centres of commerce, albeit farming or part of the railway structure that was strong at the time. But they've been left to sort of decay, and they're down on their heels. There isn't much going on there. That's one of the reasons why I'm here in Cradock, this proud old town, which has always been at the crossroads of the Eastern Cape, of the frontier, of people going up to the diamond fields, for example, in the past, or going down to Port Elizabeth. You can feel the pride in this town, but it's tired. It needs a boost, But I believe that these things are almost come around naturally. Only 2 weeks ago, Pete, we were here, and the locals were in the streets, and they were protesting against local government corruption. The municipality have been letting them down for years. They've not been spending the money in the way they've been promised. And for me, that's part of this country's evolution. You talk about transformation. It's the people standing up for their rights. So there's a pride in these outlying places. But I came across a success story the other day. As I said, a lot of these towns have been forgotten. People have moved out and they've almost overgrown. But there's a little town called Bedford close to us here. And the story goes that in 2000, this was a place where no one was living and everybody had moved out. But it just took one or two people in the community to see the potential in this place, to introduce the odd business, the odd cottage industry, albeit there was investment in the hotel in the town. And now you can visit Bedford and it's a thriving place. They've just built a private school where people from miles around want to send their kids. So there is we don't have to go on this one-way journey to decay and as I said, negativity. I think there will always blossom signs of hope in South Africa. I mean, we are at a crossroads. We've always been at a crossroads, let's face it, for the last 20 years or so. And that's one of the reasons why I am very careful in terms of my observations and my writing, that I don't make these sweeping assertions. I tend to listen to people and I observe and I compare. And I know my accent doesn't sound like it, but I do feel South African. I'm a permanent resident. I've invested my adult life in this country. I'm one of the few people that have come from Britain to South Africa and not South Africa to Britain, because a lot of people have left. And I do believe that there is a lot of good in this country. And there's the thing that inspires me about South Africans, they make a plan. They're entrepreneurial. If one thing doesn't work, they try something else. And that's a spirit that I don't often see in Britain or in England, for example. People there, there's a culture of kind of a handout culture. South Africans are accused of that sometimes, but I do see pragmatic people in every community that I visit who turn the place around. You talk about Maitiersfontein. I mean, that was a place no one wanted to visit in the 1970s. It was left to a man called David Rawdon to invest in that town, and now we've got one of South Africa's quirky little tourist destinations, and I was fortunate enough to write its history. But it's not just about the dry history, it's about the communities that live there, that rely on us to come here and to do things. And transformation for me is key, albeit on the sports field, in terms of our lived environment. I mean, probably the most physical thing for me is how the buildings have changed. You can see these old colonial buildings that perhaps have not been kept. There's not been the upkeep, but there's different uses for them, and there is regeneration as well in different ways. So I am very positive. I think we've got to be. Half glass half full, should I say? But what I will also say, and you'll appreciate this, we're not the only country with issues. I mean, look at America with Donald Trump, and Boris is in charge of England, and they're struggling at the moment. The rest of the world is also going through tough times, and I think we need to look at ourselves not just in isolation, but also in comparison with the rest of in an international situation where we're okay. We're still hanging in there.
Fantastic reflections, Dean. Really appreciate your thoughts on that and your eloquent response to what is a very difficult question, and something that we're all trying to grapple with is transformation in our own space, transformation more broadly. And thank you for your insights there. I'm sure people will be very interested to hear more from you. You're very active on the sort of speaking circuit and through your online lectures that you give. Where can people find you, Dean, in terms of your online presence? Is there a Twitter page? Is there I think you've got your daily or weekly news bulletin that goes out, which is always packed full with historic facts and interesting angles on stories. Where do people find out more about you, Dean?
Yeah, we've been running a thing called This Week in History, which is completely free. And every Monday morning I send out basically what happened this week in history in years gone by, not just South African stories, but things from around the world. So, as I said, I'd encourage anybody who's interested in entertaining history to subscribe to that newsletter. You can find details of that on my website, which is www.deanallen.co.za. That's ALLEN. And I'm very active on social media, as you said. My Facebook page is Dr. Dean Allen, author, lecturer, historian, and you can follow my sort of daily adventures on the road on that social media platform. I'm also on Instagram at Dr. Dean Allen, and also on Twitter at Dr. Dean Allen. So yeah, please do engage, send me messages, give me feedback, and as I said, My thing is, I always remember what Rudyard Kipling said. We'd all remember our history if it was told in the form of stories. And I think stories and interesting information about people and characters are the thing that enthuses us all. So I think if you're interested in that kind of storytelling and history, follow my journey and hopefully catch me at a live event at some point, because I do enjoy telling these stories to a live audience.
Well, Dean, thank you for sharing your story, the story of the FIFA 2010 World Cup as well. And we wish you all the very best in your endeavours and your journey across the country. Look forward to seeing you when you get back to the Western Cape, whenever that may be. And in the meantime, all the very best to you and your family. Thank you for sharing the time with us.
It's my pleasure, Pete, and thank you so much for your time and all the good work that you do, and best wishes to everybody out there listening.
Cheers, Dean. All the best.
Cheers.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Talking Transformation podcast. Please engage with us and let us know your thoughts on this episode. You can do so via the Anchor podcast platform. There's a voice message function available via the app. You can also follow us on Twitter via Talking Transfo and the number 1. So Talking Transfo 1. Our theme music is kindly made available by Tribal Need. Find out about the music, the street art shows here in Cape Town and Europe via tribalneed.com.